All traditions start somewhere, and it's the same for Christmas. Now, other than the baby Jesus, one of the most familiar characters this time of year is Saint Nick. Now, Reverend Austin Miles is a busy minister and chaplain in Northern California. Chaplain Miles was a writer, researcher, and technical consultant for the TV series Ancient Secrets of the Bible, and he was cast in the Hallmark Christmas movie Single Santa Seeks Mrs. Claus. He played a Santa, and you'll notice right away a significant voice. So one of the stories that Reverend Miles has a passion for is the story of St. Nick. Let's go ahead and start right there, Reverend Miles. How did St. Nicholas get his start, so to speak?
Well, actually, it was a kind of a matter-of-fact thing the way it happened. There was a man named Nicholas who was just a regular man. And he was on a ship that was traveling towards Rath, Turkey. And during this thing, a huge storm whipped up, and I mean, it was terrible. It was battering the ship. It was tearing planks from the bottom of the ship, and everybody in the ship was just terrified. And then word had gotten around that there was a man named Nicholas on board who really was a man of God and had answers to his prayers. So they began to yell for Nicholas, Nicholas. The door of the cabin opened up, and coming out in response to that call was this man with a long white beard, and he was holding onto the rail. Imagine this, as the tossing ship was so difficult to even stand on. And as he stood there with his one hand on the rail, he put his other hand up in the air and began to pray that the storm would cease. Now, this is all documented. I'm telling you this is a true story. And as he prayed, miraculously the storm calmed. So the crippled ship just drifted into the harbor of Mira. Now imagine that ship coming in, everybody beaten up on board. Now, at the very same time, there was a little church. Now, this was back in the days when it was just one church. And they divided the Catholic and Protestant much later. So this little church in Mira, the elders were in prayer because they needed a bishop for the church. They suddenly all opened their eyes and looked around startled, and they each one had received a vision. And the vision was that they were to appoint as their bishop the first man named Nicholas, who would, within the hour, enter the church to pray. Well, the ship made its way into the harbor, and as soon as it did, Nicholas disembarked. He wanted to find the nearest church and give thanks to God for his intervention during the storm that would have killed everybody on board, including him. So he sees the church, and he approaches it. And imagine this scene, the heads of the elders sitting around this table at the church, and suddenly the creaking door begins to open, and all their heads turn towards the door. And the door opens slowly, and a stately man with a snow-white beard enters the church. And he's focused totally on the altar. And he made his way quietly down to the front and knelt in prayer of thanksgiving. And as he rose to leave, the elders approached him. And one of them said, "What is your name?" And he said, "Nicholas." "God has sent you here to be our new bishop," said another. They were all excited, joyfully. They fitted to surprise Nicholas with a long, priestly red robe and the mitre that they would wear. And he quickly became known as the Bishop of Miracles because, like with the ship, there were so many spectacular answers to his prayers.
What kind of man was Nicholas? Did he have a lot of money?
He had come from a wealthy family, and he was wealthy through family inheritance. But in his mind, wealth came from God and belonged to God. And in fact, the very reason for his existence, he thought, was to serve God. And that's how he lived his life. Well, Nicholas became concerned. It had a custom in Turkey years ago. And I don't think that was the only country, but especially it stood out for me in Turkey. Now, if little girls there did not have a dowry so that they could marry, they would be sold into slavery. Now, Bishop Nicholas had given away most of his own fortune, so he went about, and he was so liked by everyone, he managed to collect gold from admirers. He needed it, didn't say what he wanted to do with it, but they willingly gave it to him, what they had. Now, on December the 6th, that was the date, while it was still dark, he wrapped the gold coins in several little bags and visited each home that had a daughter without a dowry. And as he had approached the home, he had looked in the window, he had dropped a bag of gold through the windows of each of the homes, which landed on the hearth, where the girls' clothes would be drying. Well, when the gold was discovered the next morning, the family absolutely rejoiced. Their little daughters had been saved from slavery. They thought, wow, this has to be from God. Well, Nicholas continued that every year, and it became an annual tradition. But nobody knew the identity of the mysterious benefactor who was around the village on that date each year. Now, this is kind of interesting. On one of those nights, as Nicholas put his arm through the window to drop the bag of gold, instead of it landing on the hearth, the bag fell into a stocking that was hanging in front of the fireplace to dry. It was found the next morning to the very delight of the family, which is where we got the custom of hanging up Christmas stockings. So this is where that started, and shortly before Nicholas's death, which occurred on December the 6th, the date of his annual visit, it was learned that he was the individual who brought so much joy to so many families.
How did he become Saint Nicholas, the saint part of it?
So about 500 years later, in the 9th century, and by this time the church had become Catholic Protestant churches, Nicholas was canonized by the Roman Catholic Church, and that's where the name Saint Nicholas came from. And since the celebration of Christmas came after the life of Saint Nicholas, now think of that, remember, as the story of St. Nicholas spread, the French nuns in the 12th century began making annual nighttime visits to poor families with children, and they would leave fruit and nuts, which these families could not afford, because they were very impressed by St. Nicholas, the work he did, and they picked it up. And so they made their gift-giving rounds on what became known as St. Nicholas Eve. That still exists today, December the 5th. And the tradition spread throughout the old world and then across the ocean to the new. Many people to this day still celebrate Christmas on December the 6th. Now, he became known as the patron saint of many countries, including Russia, becoming a major ingredient in the Russian Christmas celebration. So England then made St. Nicholas Father Christmas. Remember how the name's picked up?
Right.
And then Germany picked up on it and became Father Christmas. But in France, he became known as Papa Noel, and of course the South American countries began calling him Papa Noel as well. Now, various forms of Nicholas started to come out in the secular world over the years, and as they did, of all things, some unexpected problems came out of it. Protests came out of the church. Martin Luther pounded his pulpit proclaiming that the true Christmas message was being lost by the St. Nicholas connection. Well, the Dutch came to the rescue then and adopted what they believed to be a more religious view of Nicholas that would, of course, satisfy the critics. The Dutch-German Protestant Reform movement brought with it the idea that the Christ child should be the standard bearer for Christmas. Now, the German word for Christ child is Christkindl.
I didn't know that.
In 1822, on the night before Christmas, which the world began to celebrate on December the 24th, you may remember Clement Moore wrote a poem about the gift giver for his 6 children. And that poem, The Night Before Christmas, was published the following year in the Sentinel of Troy, New York. Now, up to that time, Nicholas had taken various forms. Well, Mr. Moore defined Nicholas once and for all and renamed him Santa Claus. Now, this is kind of interesting, too. He had no doubt been influenced by the Dutch, who named him Sinter, which means saint, and Claus, short for Nicholas. Sinterklaas. And that became Sinterklaas in general. Now, others who spoke broken English, knowing that gold had been found on the hearth by the fireplace, started a new legend. Now, this time the gift giver came down the chimney and would land in the cinders of burning embers. So they called him Sinterklaasen, which would be in Moore's hands become Santa Claus. But Clement Moore's poem made Santa Claus famous. He even named the reindeer, if you remember.
Mm-hmm.
Clement's poem made Santa famous, naming the reindeer, but he also made the reindeer fly. Well, there's been several speculations how the reindeer could fly. I always said, well, they would eat a light lunch, that would help a lot. It all came together. All of these various ideas came together with one big idea. Then there was an artist named Thomas Nast. He was a Harper's Weekly cartoonist, and he began to show what Santa looked like. He dressed him in red, which had been the official color of the priestly robes worn by St. Nicholas. And then he went further by making Santa plump and jolly, and to show how much of a church connection to Santa there is, Clement Moore's father was the Episcopal Bishop of New York, and Clement Moore himself was professor of theology at Union Theological Seminary. But it's interesting interesting to note that the clearest image of Santa came not from the church or from a poet, but by, of all things, a soft drink company advertisement. That drawing, you may remember, known as the Coca-Cola Santa, was created and drawn by Haddon Sundblom, who was the artist, made him totally definable. Santa has been replaced by the created Santa. St. Nicholas still is remembered in the background. And Santa, who does indeed delight millions of kids, there's no question about it. But I think perhaps that through the hustle and bustle, maybe we've lost the very core of what Christmas is. Christmas is a time of love and sharing with people in need, whether we know them or not.
Yeah, and St. Nick definitely personifies that love and sharing. I'm George Rath, and you're listening to Closer Look. We're talking about Christmas holiday history and traditions. James Cooper was born and grew up in London with a passion for Christmas. A few years ago, he started the website whychristmas.com. We are in what is called the Advent season.
Yes, I mean, Advent is a Latin word for coming, and is traditionally the four Sundays and weeks before Christmas. This year it starts on the 2nd of December. And in lots of in the Orthodox tradition, in the Catholic tradition, it's very much observed as a time of preparation. In the UK and the USA, most people just had Advent calendars with bits of chocolate in them, which doesn't quite seem the...
It's a little bit different, isn't it?
Really.
How about the candy cane?
From my research, the one that I found was that you'll see that a lot of Christmas traditions seem to come from Germany originally, and probably so did the candy cane. It seems to date back about 250 years, and they started as straight white sugar sticks. And one story says that a choir master was worried about his choristers being noisy during the long Christmas services, so he wanted to give them something to eat to keep them quiet. So he bent one of these sugar candy sticks into a J shape to symbolise Jesus or the shepherd's crook. And around 1900, the red stripes were added and flavoured with peppermint.
The Christmas tree, okay, that has a variety of possible beginnings as well, you said.
Having trees in your house during the winter dates back well before Christian times, because Christmas is celebrated around the time that the winter solstice was in Northern Europe, when it gets dark really early. And people used to bring evergreen and especially fir trees and holly and the ivy and that sort of stuff inside their houses during the winter, just to sort of brighten them up and to remind themselves that, spring would come, and that, plants would start growing again. And so, but having an actual tree in the house, there's a few different thoughts of how that came into being. There's, back in the medieval times, there used to be the plays that they put on in the weeks before Christmas, and they'd have a thing called a paradise tree, which was meant to be the tree from the Garden of Eden, and it was normally a wooden sort of cutout of a shape of a tree that was decorated with apples and things. So one thought is that the Christmas tree became sort of an indoor version of that people had seen in their town squares and that, and they wanted to make more personal in their house. And there are other stories, such as Martin Luther going out for a winter walk one night in the forest in Germany and seeing all the stars twinkling through his forest and thinking, why don't I bring a tree into the house and put some candles on it to remind me of the stars?
Very interesting stuff. How about the wreath, the holly and the ivy, that sort of thing?
The circle of the wreath is meant to represent everlasting life, because it's a continuation of life. So as Christians, we believe that, because Jesus died for us, if we believe in him, when we die, we have everlasting life. So that's a symbol of the wreath. And holly and the ivy, again, were some of the few things that are around that looked nice during the winter. The prickles on the holly have come to represent the crown of thorns. And in some parts of Scandinavia, the nickname for holly is actually Christ's thorn. And the red berries are meant to represent Jesus' blood on the cross. And ivy has long held traditions of protecting people. It's one old tradition that if you hung it outside the church, it would stop the church being struck by lightning. But it also is ivy's traditionally a symbol that because it's a climber, it clings to things, that we need to hold on to God for our life.
Reverend Miles, if Saint Nick were speaking right now and had a message for our listeners, young and old, what might he say?
Hold on just a minute, wait. Oh, Merry biggest joy I have is the love I have from children all over the world every year. But I'm an invented part of the Christmas season. Jesus is the reason for the season, and he is who we should really be looking at. Now, I am with you just once a year, but Jesus is with you every day of the year. Now, Mrs. Claus totally agrees with me. Jesus is the only one that we worship, and you should do the same. Gotta go now. Merry Christmas! Ho, 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 ho.
What a great message to end on. My thanks to Reverend Austin Miles and James Cooper for their expertise and for helping us to understand some of the origins of Christmas traditions and symbols. You'll find James Cooper's website at www.whychristmas.com. For a closer look, I'm George Rath.